Picture this. It's a cold January morning in 1996, and you're walking to work after a heavy snowfall has blanketed the streets of Nanjing, China. You're a cleaning lady, just trying to make an honest living when you spot a black plastic bag on Huaqiao Road. Maybe someone dropped their groceries, you think. Maybe it's something valuable that fell from a delivery truck. You take it home thinking you found some free pork for dinner. But as you rinse what you believe is meat under running water, something catches your eye. Something that makes your blood run cold, and your hands shake uncontrollably. 3 human fingers. I can't help but wonder what went through that woman's mind in that moment. The realization that she'd been handling human remains that someone's life had been brutally taken and discarded like garbage on a busy street. But here's the thing that still haunts investigators to this day. This wasn't just a simple murder. Over the next 2 weeks, more black bags would surface across Nanjing, at construction sites near university buildings and hospital areas at garbage dumps, each one containing carefully dismembered pieces of what authorities would later confirm was a 19-year-old university student named Liu Mei-Chen. But the twisted details of how this young woman died, and the methodical way her killer disposed of her remains, would shock even seasoned homicide detectives. We're talking about over 2,000 individual pieces of human tissue, each cut with surgical precision. Her internal organs were missing. Some parts had been boiled. You might think this sounds like the work of a deranged serial killer, but here's where this case takes an even darker turn. After nearly 3 decades of investigation involving thousands of suspects and countless man-hours, Chinese authorities still have no idea who did this or why. This isn't just another unsolved murder case. This is a mystery that has captivated an entire nation, spawned countless internet theories, and left investigators questioning everything they thought they knew about criminal behavior. What kind of person could commit such an unthinkable act? And more importantly, are they still out there? Let me take you back to January 1996 to understand who Liu Mei-Chen really was and how her life intersected with something so horrific that it defies comprehension. Liu Mei-Chen was born in March 1976 in a small town in Jiangsu province. By all accounts, she was an ordinary young woman with extraordinary determination. After failing her first attempt at university entrance exams, she didn't give up. In September 1995, at age 19, she finally achieved her dream: acceptance into Nanjing University's Information Management and Computer Applications program. Here's what strikes me about Mei-Chen's story. She was just 3 months into her university experience when everything went wrong. 3 months. Think about that for a moment. She had barely settled into campus life, barely made friends, barely begun to explore her independence as a young adult. Her roommates described her as tall for a Chinese woman with short hair and a slightly hoarse voice that somehow made her seem older than her years. She was funny, they said, the kind of person who could make others laugh even during stressful exam periods. But there was something else about Mei-Chen that would later become crucial to the investigation. She was relatively isolated socially, with few close relationships outside her immediate circle. The timeline of her final week is both ordinary and heartbreaking. On January 7, 1996, she attended a birthday party for a high school friend who was also studying in Nanjing. It was a normal celebration. Young people enjoying each other's company, probably talking about their futures, their classes, maybe complaining about professors or discussing weekend plans. January 9th was her last normal day. She spent it exploring the city with fellow students from her hometown province, staying out late, living the kind of carefree life that university students everywhere take for granted. You might think this sounds like any typical college experience, and you'd be right. That's what makes what happened next so disturbing. January 10th brought unexpected trouble. A student in her dormitory had been caught using an illegal electric pot, a minor violation that somehow resulted in Mei-Chen as the floor representative receiving a formal reprimand from university officials. It was the kind of bureaucratic punishment that feels devastating when you're 19 but laughable when you're older. Still, it clearly affected her. That afternoon, she told her classmates she wasn't feeling well and wanted to rest in the dormitory. She asked them to excuse her from afternoon classes. But here's where the timeline becomes crucial. After lunch, instead of resting, Mei-Chen left the dormitory alone. Multiple witnesses saw her that evening on Qingdao Road south of the university campus. She was wearing a red jacket, apparently a popular style among female students at the time. I can't help but think about how that red jacket meant to keep her warm during the cold. January weather would become one of the last confirmed sightings of her alive. And then, nothing. Complete silence. No phone calls, no return to the dormitory, no contact with friends or family. Liu Mei-Chen simply vanished into the winter night of January 10, 1996. What happened during those missing hours between her last sighting and January 18th, when the first body parts were discovered, remains one of the most disturbing mysteries in Chinese criminal history. The heavy snowfall on January 18th had prevented the cleaning lady from working her usual route, which means those black bags containing Mei-Chen's remains had been sitting on the streets of Nanjing for an unknown period of time. But here's the detail that still gives me chills. The methodical distribution of her remains across the city suggests her killer had intimate knowledge of Nanjing's layout disposal sites and possibly even the cleaning schedules of various municipal workers. This wasn't a crime of passion. This was something far more calculated and disturbing. When that phone call came into Nanjing Police Station on January 19, 1996, I doubt anyone could have predicted they were about to embark on one of the most complex and disturbing investigations in Chinese criminal history. The initial response was swift and professional. Within hours, a specialized investigative team had secured the cleaning lady's home and begun the grim task of examining what she'd discovered. But as more black bags surfaced across the city over the following days, it became clear this wasn't going to be a typical homicide case. Let me paint you a picture of what investigators were dealing with. By January 31st, body parts had been discovered at over a dozen locations across Nanjing. We're talking about construction sites, university grounds, hospital areas, and garbage collection points. Each discovery site seemed deliberately chosen as if the perpetrator was following some twisted logic that only made sense to them. The forensic analysis revealed details that even seasoned medical examiners found disturbing. The dismemberment had been carried out with surgical precision, each cut clean and methodical. The total weight of recovered remains was approximately 32 kilograms, suggesting virtually complete dismemberment of the victim's body. But here's what haunted the forensic team: several vital organs, including the heart, liver, and spleen, were never found. You might wonder why this detail is so significant. In most dismemberment cases, perpetrators are trying to dispose of evidence quickly and efficiently. They're not usually concerned with anatomical precision or organ removal. This level of methodical dissection suggested someone with either medical training or, disturbingly, someone who took pleasure in the process itself. The forensic team made another chilling discovery. Some of the remains showed evidence of being boiled or cooked. Not burned or destroyed for disposal purposes, but actually cooked. I can't help but think about what kind of mindset would lead someone to do this, and frankly, some possibilities are too disturbing to fully explore. Based on the precision of the cuts and the apparent anatomical knowledge required, investigators initially focused their attention on individuals with medical training: doctors, medical students, veterinarians, professional butchers. Anyone who would have the skill and tools necessary to perform such precise dismemberment. This led to one of the most extensive suspect screenings in Chinese law enforcement history. Every medical professional in the Nanjing area was questioned. Medical schools were scrutinized. Hospital staff members were investigated. The inquiry was so thorough that it created a climate of suspicion and fear throughout the city's medical community. But the investigation didn't stop there. Recognizing that the victim was a university student and that several body parts had been found on or near campus, police expanded their focus to include the entire Nanjing University community. We're talking about thousands of students, faculty members, and staff, all potential suspects, in a case that seemed to have no logical motive. The campus interviews were particularly intensive. Every student was questioned about their whereabouts during the critical time period. Alibis were checked and double-checked. Anyone with even minor behavioral issues or academic problems found themselves under intense scrutiny. The psychological pressure on the university community was enormous. What strikes me about this phase of the investigation is how it revealed both the strengths and limitations of 1990s police work. The dedication and thoroughness were impressive, but investigators were working without many of the technological tools we take for granted today. No widespread surveillance cameras, no cell phone tracking, no advanced DNA analysis, no digital forensics. They were essentially trying to solve a methodically planned crime using old-school detective work, interviews, physical evidence, and behavioral analysis. And for 3 months it seemed like this approach might actually work. Leads were followed, suspects were questioned, and the investigation team remained optimistic. But then something happened that would haunt this case for decades to come. Every lead went cold. Every suspect was cleared. Every theory fell apart under scrutiny. By April 1996, investigators faced a terrifying reality. They had one of the most brutal and methodical murders in Chinese history, and absolutely no idea who had committed it. For 12 years, the Liu Mei-Chen case remained buried in police files, another unsolved murder that investigators hoped new technology might eventually crack. But in 2008, something unexpected happened that would thrust this cold case back into the spotlight and spawn countless theories that persist to this day. It started with a single cryptic post on a Chinese internet forum on May 28, 2008. An anonymous user with the ID 60.211.8.6 left a haunting message. Liu Mei-Chen, I really miss you. I hope you rest in peace. Then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, the user vanished from the platform. You might think this was just another internet troll or someone seeking attention, but the timing was significant. China was dealing with the aftermath of the devastating Sichuan earthquake, yet someone felt compelled to remember a university student who had been murdered over a decade earlier. Some people say it was just coincidence, but here's the twist. That single post would eventually generate more investigative leads than the original police inquiry. 3 weeks later, on June 19, 2008, a user calling themselves Black Mass posted a detailed analysis on the popular Tianya forum titled An Opinion on the Nanjing University Dismemberment Case. What Black Mass wrote was unlike anything that had been publicly discussed about the case before. The post introduced theories that seemed to come straight out of a psychological thriller. Black Mass suggested that Liu Mei-Chen might have been killed by someone with extreme psychological disorders, possibly involving cannibalistic tendencies. The post used terms like childhood psychological shadows and heavy metal music obsession, language that hadn't appeared in any official police reports or media coverage. I can't help but wonder where Black Mass got such specific psychological insights. The post read less like internet speculation and more like someone with inside knowledge of investigative theories that had never been made public. The level of detail about the crime scene, the methodology of the dismemberment, and the psychological profile of the potential perpetrator was startling. The Black Mass post went viral in ways that social media posts about true crime cases do today. Forums exploded with discussion theories and counter-theories. Some users praised the analysis as brilliant detective work. Others questioned whether Black Mass might actually be connected to the case in some way. The speculation became so intense that Nanjing police eventually investigated Black Mass's identity. What they found was both reassuring and anticlimactic. Black Mass turned out to be a heavy metal music enthusiast whose father had been involved in the original investigation. He had written the post based on secondhand information and his own psychological theories, not any insider knowledge. But the internet detective work was just getting started. In July 2008, someone calling themselves Red Windmill Owner claimed to have interviewed Liu Mei-Chen's family posing as an official investigator. This impersonation led to their arrest, but not before they had gathered and published additional details about the case that further fueled online speculation. By this point, the case had taken on a life of its own in Chinese internet culture. Multiple theories emerged from the online community. The medical professional theory suggested the killer was a doctor or medical student with access to surgical tools and anatomical knowledge. This aligned with the original police investigation, but couldn't explain the apparent lack of motive. The student group theory proposed that Liu Mei-Chen had been killed by fellow students, possibly to cover up some other crime or secret. Proponents of this theory pointed to the intimate knowledge of campus layouts and disposal sites. The cannibalistic killer theory was the most disturbing, suggesting the precision of the dismemberment and the missing organs indicated someone with extremely deviant psychological needs. Perhaps most intriguingly, the hometown connection theory emerged when a former neighborhood watch member claimed he had seen two suspicious individuals from Liu Mei-Chen's home province carrying black bags around the time of her disappearance. But this witness had waited nearly 15 years to come forward, raising obvious questions about the reliability of his memory. What strikes me about this phase of the case is how the internet became a kind of parallel investigation. Thousands of amateur detectives were analyzing crime scene photos, debating psychological profiles, and developing theories that professional investigators had either considered and dismissed or never thought to explore. Some of these theories were surprisingly sophisticated. Others were clearly the product of too much imagination and too little forensic knowledge. But all of them reflected a public fascination with a case that seemed to defy rational explanation. The problem was that none of these theories, no matter how detailed or compelling, could provide what investigators needed: most concrete evidence linking a specific individual to the crime.
Here's the harsh reality about the Liu Mei-Chen case that most people don't fully grasp. There have never been any formal legal proceedings. No arrests, no trials, no convictions. After nearly 3 decades, this remains an active but unsolved investigation, highlighting some of the most challenging aspects of criminal justice in complex murder cases. You might wonder how it's possible that such an extensively investigated case could remain completely unsolved. The answer lies in understanding the enormous legal and evidentiary hurdles that investigators have faced from day one. In criminal law, there's a fundamental principle that evidence must be sufficient to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. In the Liu Mei-Chen case, investigators have never been able to establish even the most basic elements required for prosecution: a definitive suspect, a clear motive, or physical evidence linking any individual to the crime. The forensic challenges have been particularly frustrating.
Despite the methodical nature of the dismemberment, the perpetrator appears to have been extremely careful about leaving traceable evidence. No fingerprints were recovered from any of the disposal sites. No witnesses saw the actual disposal of the body parts. No murder weapon was ever found. In 2008, recognizing that advances in DNA technology might provide new leads, investigators made a significant effort to collect genetic material from Liu Mei-Chen's family. They hoped that improved DNA analysis techniques might reveal genetic traces that had been missed in the original investigation. But even this modernized approach failed to produce actionable leads. I can't help but think about how different this case might have been if it had occurred just a few years later. By 2000, surveillance cameras were becoming more common in Chinese cities. Cell phone tracking was becoming a standard investigative tool. Digital forensics could trace online activities, But in 1996, investigators were working with 1990s technology to solve what appears to have been a very sophisticated crime. The legal challenges extend beyond just gathering evidence. Chinese criminal procedure requires that prosecutors be able to present a coherent theory of the crime, not just what happened, but how, when, where, and why. In Liu Mei-Chen's case, investigators have never been able to establish a convincing motive. Was this a random crime of opportunity? The methodical dismemberment suggests extensive planning, which contradicts the random crime theory. Was it personal, perhaps a romantic relationship gone wrong? Investigators found no evidence of any significant relationships that might have led to such extreme violence. Was it the work of someone with severe psychological disorders? Possibly, but without a suspect, this remains pure speculation. The jurisdictional aspects have also created complications.
Body parts were found across multiple districts in Nanjing, and there were allegations that some remains might have been transported from Liu Mei-Chen's home province. Coordinating investigations across different law enforcement agencies, each with their own procedures and priorities, has undoubtedly slowed progress. Perhaps most significantly, the passage of time has created legal challenges that investigators couldn't have foreseen in 1996. Witnesses have moved away, died, or simply forgotten crucial details. Physical evidence has degraded. The original crime scene has been altered by urban development. Some of the locations where body parts were found no longer exist in their original form. There's also the question of statute of limitations, though in China, murder cases typically don't have time limits for prosecution. However, the practical reality is that building a prosecutable case becomes exponentially more difficult as years pass.
The internet speculation phenomena I discussed earlier has created an additional legal complication. So many theories and allegations have been circulated online that any eventual prosecution would need to overcome a mountain of misinformation and public preconceptions. Defense attorneys would likely argue that their client couldn't receive a fair trial due to decades of prejudicial publicity. What's particularly tragic about the legal aspects of this case is how they've affected Liu Mei-Chen's family. In many legal systems, families of victims can find some measure of closure through the trial process, even in cases that end in acquittal. But Liu Mei-Chen's parents have never had that opportunity. They've never been able to confront their daughter's killer in court, never heard an official explanation of what happened, never received the kind of formal acknowledgement of their loss that a trial provides. The case remains officially active, which means investigators continue to follow up on new leads and tips. But realistically, after nearly 30 years without a breakthrough, the likelihood of solving this case through traditional investigative methods seems increasingly remote. As I reflect on the Liu Mei-Chen case nearly 3 decades after that cleaning lady made her horrifying discovery, I'm struck by how this single unsolved murder has become something much larger than a criminal investigation. It's become a mirror reflecting our deepest fears about safety, justice, and the darker aspects of human nature. The immediate impact on Nanjing University and the surrounding community was profound and lasting. Campus security protocols were completely overhauled. Students, particularly female students, became far more cautious about walking alone at night. The sense of safety that university communities depend on was shattered in a way that took years to rebuild. But perhaps more significantly, this case has highlighted the limitations of even the most dedicated investigative efforts when confronted with a truly methodical and careful perpetrator. The Nanjing police invested thousands of man-hours, interviewed thousands of suspects, and followed every conceivable lead. Yet the case remains unsolved, raising uncomfortable questions about whether some crimes are simply unsolvable. The internet age has given this case a second life that I don't think anyone could have predicted. The online speculation and amateur detective work has created a kind of parallel investigation that continues to this day. Facebook groups, Reddit threads, and Chinese social media platforms regularly feature new theories and discussions about the case. In some ways, the internet has kept Liu Mei-Chen's memory alive in a way that traditional media coverage never could have. You might think this ongoing public interest is entirely positive, but there's a darker side to consider. The endless speculation and conspiracy theories have sometimes overshadowed the human tragedy at the center of this story.
Liu Mei-Chen wasn't a puzzle to be solved or a mystery to be debated. She was a young woman with dreams, aspirations, and people who loved her. I often wonder what her life might have looked like if she had lived. She would be in her late 40s now, possibly married with children, maybe working in the technology field she was studying. The computer applications program she was enrolled in was relatively new in 1996. She might have been part of China's technological revolution. Instead, her potential was cut short in the most brutal way imaginable. The case has also raised important questions about campus safety and student vulnerability that remain relevant today. Liu Mei-Chen was isolated, socially new to the university environment and far from her family support system. These factors didn't cause her death, but they may have made her a more vulnerable target. Universities worldwide have since implemented better support systems for students who might be at risk. From a criminological perspective, this case represents something of a perfect storm. A highly organized perpetrator who left minimal evidence, a victim with few close social connections who might not be quickly missed, and an investigation hampered by 1990s technology limitations. It's the kind of case that criminal justice professionals study, not just to understand what happened, but to develop better prevention and investigation strategies. The psychological aspects continue to fascinate and disturb experts. The level of organization and planning evident in the crime suggests someone capable of functioning normally in society while harboring extremely disturbing impulses. This contradiction, the ability to plan methodically while committing acts of extreme violence, challenges our understanding of criminal psychology. Perhaps most troubling is the possibility that the perpetrator is still alive and living freely. If Liu Mei-Chen's killer was a young adult in 1996, they would only be in their 40s or 50s today. They might have families, careers, and communities that have no idea of their past actions. This isn't just speculation designed to create fear. It's a statistical reality that law enforcement officials have to consider, but I don't want to end this story on a note of despair. While justice has been delayed, it hasn't necessarily been denied. Cold cases have been solved after much longer periods. Advances in DNA technology, digital forensics, and investigative techniques continue to provide new tools for solving historical crimes. Someone somewhere knows what happened to Liu Mei-Chen, and it's possible that person will eventually come forward. More importantly, Liu Mei-Chen's story has contributed to important changes in how we think about campus safety, criminal investigation, and victim advocacy. Her death wasn't meaningless, even though her killer has never been caught. It has educated law enforcement, informed safety protocols, and reminded us all of our shared responsibility to protect the vulnerable members of our communities. The questions this case raises are profound and uncomfortable. How do we balance the public's right to information with respect for victims and their families? How do we prevent speculation from overwhelming facts? How do we maintain hope for justice while accepting the reality that some crimes may never be solved? I don't have answers to these questions, and I suspect neither do the investigators who have devoted years of their lives to this case. But I think asking these questions, continuing to grapple with the complexity and tragedy of cases like Liu Mei-Chen's, is part of how we honor the memory of victims and work toward a more just society. What do you think happened to Liu Mei-Chen, and do you believe this case will ever be solved? More importantly, what can we learn from her story about protecting the people in our communities who might be most vulnerable? Thank you for joining me in exploring this complex and tragic case. If you found this analysis thought-provoking, please consider sharing it and continuing the conversation in the comments below.
Remember, behind every true crime story is a real person whose life mattered and whose memory deserves our respect and thoughtful consideration.